welcome back to your weekly Premier Injuries podcast, where we discuss all the things to do with injuries in the Premier League. We look to give insights into players with knowledge on return times and cutting through rumour or misinformation. Plus we talk tactics and data of players who have gone out injured or are returning to their teams. This is a weekly show, same time every Thursday through the season. So if you have any inquiries, you can comment below or tweet any of us. We love you getting involved. And also, before we get into the analysis of the big stories, remember to like, share the video, and also subscribe to the channel. There's so much good free content. But as always, I have to introduce him first, the big man Raj. It's been a little bit while. How have you enjoyed the international break?
I mean, it's been interesting. It's always fun to watch these games where, one, you expect a decent level of football, but I think the concern is always, considering it's an injury podcast, it's the interactions between the travel. You go to some of these higher intensity matches and seeing how players are coming back. So there's the enjoyment of not watching Arsenal for a little bit of time, but then also all the other variables that come into play. So.
And then over to you, Ben. Has it been a restful period for you? Because it's always kind of on, isn't it, during the season?
I definitely wouldn't say it's been restful. It's a nice break from the Premier League, but tracking players in far-flung corners of the earth is always difficult. And then we've got the added problems created by COVID and quarantine and FIFA 5-day rules and red list countries and amber list countries. And it's been a bit of a minefield, if the truth be told. I'm lost now. Elite sportsman exemptions. Listen, I just know we're going to go into game week 4. And if I can get 11 players on that pitch, then it's going to be a massive bonus, because I think there's going to be a lot of surprises come kickoff times on Saturday, when we find out if players have been double jabbed or they haven't.
Yeah, it's very true. And, just before we go into this analysis, it's kind of baffling, the period that we're living through. One of the wildest international breaks ever, a coup stopping matches, so, wars going into place, players being prosecuted for going onto the pitch, then not going on the pitch, national football associations going against their players. I mean, would you say, Ben, that this is the most absurd international break that you've ever seen?
Yeah, certainly from my experience, I've never been, party to anything like this anytime before. Of course, there are always, the odd occasion where clubs maybe fail to, release a player, or, or there's some off-field issues which maybe impact on a player's involvement, but nothing certainly on this scale.
And to you, Raj, as well, is it kind of interesting from your perspective, almost seeing, like I mentioned there, a football association going against their own players? Surely this is going to bite them in the buttocks in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mess. It's a mess. So there's just it's been a very interesting break in that regard. I think the Brazil-Argentina snafu kind of, to me, summed up the entire thing. So.
Yeah, well, we're going to get onto that in a second, but I thought we'd start off proceedings with a nice tone. We're going to talk about Cristiano Ronaldo, his return to the Premier League. This is a huge discussion point, because people aren't sure if he's going to start. Is he not going to start? Has he trained enough? I mean, what are your thoughts and feelings on this matter, Ben? Is he going to be starting against your boys, Newcastle?
I hope not. I mean, I'm in camp Cristiano out. I think a role from the bench, most likely. I'm going against the grain. A few reasons as to why I believe that might be the case. I'm looking at that that front line, that 4. And I think we just found out that Fred will be omitted from the matchday squad as it currently stands this weekend. That might make things a little bit easier in terms of Ollie dropping Pogba back into that double pivot 6 on a 4-2-3-1. And obviously we've seen the departure of Dan James during the transfer window. Mason Greenwood has to start. 100% without question. Now, that's whether he gets that centre-forward striking role or whether he plays in a 3. We know that Jadon Sancho's returned to the training pitches after being released from the senior England squad. So that's good. We know that Bruno's going to be in there. So there's one place up for grabs. I think the fact that Ronaldo conveniently picked up that yellow card, which meant that he was suspended for Portugal's last game and ensured that he could return earlier to England, do his 5-day quarantine period, and then, join his teammates a little bit earlier than anticipated, has helped. But I'm just, I'm looking at how Ollie may manage that squad. And yes, we know Ronaldo is a supreme athlete. We know he's been at the club before, but this is a different era. This is a different philosophy. And I just think that maybe Ollie will want to, again, just show people that he is the boss. He makes the decisions, and he'll stick with those players that he's had faith in over those first 3 game weeks, and bring Ronaldo on from the bench with a start potentially in the Champions League would be my thoughts.
Raj, what are your thoughts on this situation? Are you Ronaldo no? Are you saying yes, he's going to be in the starting 11? And also, with the lack of training that he's had with the team, do you think that that's actually a problem for somebody like him?
Well, to answer the last part first, I think with a player like him who's in incredible shape, the fitness aspect may be less of a concern because he keeps himself in that world-class shape year-round. So is it still a concern? Naturally, of course. That's always a concern when you come into a new season and now a new league that he hasn't played in for how many years. And as Ben always talks about, we know the data on Premier League, the number of high intensity events is simply just higher. And then of course with Champions League coming up, I'm quite torn. Like Ben said, it could be, Solskjaer wanting to show that he is the boss and wanting the team to play a certain way. But then there's also so much external buildup to see him play with the team, right? And we know that pressure comes into play. I mean, that pressure might have been part of the reason why they went and got him in the first place, because they didn't want him to go to City. So it's so hard to say the calculation here. Does he play? I think absolutely. I'm not sure on the starter aspect, though.
Do you think that the data will come into mind there, though? The fact that Manchester United have kind of not massively overperformed in terms of their XG, they've kind of looked to struggle in the Southampton game. They weren't fantastic in that. Could that come into the thinking as well? A bit like Kevin De Bruyne was rushed back by Manchester City. It was almost seen as a necessity to kind of bring that player in.
Yeah, I think it definitely has to come into calculation in that regard. So, but again, that has to be balanced with, what are his physiological metrics showing? What's his fitness showing? And then again, the other variable, I think a big one is people want to see him play. And I think, it's a massive, massive story and a massive return. So
the short answer from both of you, yes or no, Ronaldo, is he worth getting this game week in terms of Fantasy Premier League? Ben?
No.
And Raj?
No, I'm not. There's no short answer, because even from the bench against Newcastle, with a 15-minute cameo, he could score a hat-trick. What I'm saying is I don't think he'll start, but I wouldn't necessarily put you off buying him.
And
That's
Raj?
my short answer.
No, I mean, I pretty much concur with Ben.
Okay. I mean, that is kind of a hard one, especially as myself, somebody who's interested in buying him, but I am a risk-adverse player as well. So it really goes to the deadline with that one. Now, we've got to turn our attentions to the international injuries. There's a few key talking points to go through, Ben, and I think you're the best one equipped to explain all the important news with that, because again, like I said at the beginning, there seems to be a bit of misinformation, a lot of people panicking over certain players and their fitness. Just tell us, put the people's minds at ease, or maybe highlight some problems.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to put a lot of minds at ease, because it's always difficult, ascertaining what exactly is going on when players haven't returned to their clubs and with being assessed by their own medical teams. I mean, Romelu Lukaku was a big talking point. Chelsea have got a great fixture this weekend against a depleted Aston Villa side. So Lukaku will be one of the go-to strikers. You know, he's already hit the ground running in those first 2 game weeks. Now, he's flagged an ongoing niggling thigh issue following his last game for Belgium. And he said before his return to England that he would get that checked out and he would have a scan. You know, so again, we don't know the severity of that. What I would say, if it's something that has been managed over the last sort of game or two, then that's good news in effect. The only worry would be is if that problem is being exacerbated in any way, shape or form by playing for Belgium. Otherwise, I would, you know, I'm fairly confident that Lukaku will be available and will be ready for Chelsea. However, again, the caveat would be we have Champions League coming up. We know that Thomas Tuchel isn't one to take any unnecessary risks. Let's take a look at Ben Chilwell as an example for that, a player who hasn't had a lot of minutes over the summer with England, isn't maybe at that required level in terms of his conditioning. And, you know, Tuchel has sort of kept him in the peripherals of the squad with Marcus Alonso. So he will have confidence, even the likes of Kai Havertz, Timo Werner, you know, who can maybe fill that striking role for a game or possibly 2, you know, if Romelu Lukaku isn't quite 100%. So that's definitely one to watch. I mean, elsewhere, Chelsea and N'Golo Kante, he was forced off at Anfield and also released from the French squad. Fortunately, that's not you know, one of his hereditary sort of hamstring issues that always seem to hamper him. This is an ankle problem. And at the minute, again, we're about 50-50 on whether he could make the squad. But, you know, with the likes of Jorginho and Kovacic in there, again, does Tuchel need to take any risks with Kante? I don't think so. DCL, Dominic Calvert-Lewin. We touched upon it on the last podcast with Raj, and we talked about this toe injury. I think it's a little crack in his toe actually that he picked up in pre-season, and that's resulted in him being unable to train fully, you know, between games. And Rafa said that was certainly affecting him and his inability to play 90 minutes. Well, we've seen that in game week 3 when DCL was actually forced off with a quad issue, and that could have been one of 2 reasons. One, maybe the toe injury has altered his gait and he put additional stress on different aspects of his body. Or secondly, it could be just that he isn't getting enough minutes on the training pitches, that load. He isn't quite 100% fit and where he should be, and it's a fatigue-related problem. The good news is for Everton, they don't play until, I think it's Burnley on Monday, so they do have a couple of extra days recovery. Now, if it is that slight sort of grade 1 minor strain, then, you know, he's well within that time frame to potentially return. But as we've talked about prior to that, you know, similar to hamstring, because it's a muscle that's very much linked to a kicking mechanism. It's a one that can be exacerbated quite easily. So again, it's not one that Rafa will want to risk unnecessarily. Elsewhere, who we're looking at, we can look at. Well, I tell you what, it's a good segue, some good news for Manchester City, and it's a great one to lead into Raj, who, and I'll give him a plug on 3CB Performance on YouTube. You really need to check this out for his analysis tactics, but also his injury insights and updates, and just giving context. And he gives some brilliant update on Phil Foden recently, and I'm sure he's got his own thoughts on Kevin De Bruyne as well.
Yeah, I mean, for City, we saw Foden. Well, we saw both finally return to training in Foden's case after a lengthy layoff. And the video I had up on it was his first session was done exclusively on sand, and that's commonly seen when you're suffering a foot injury. The team, as they're notorious for doing, has been quite vague with the injury, but it does sound like, my guess, it was some midfoot injury. And so when you're training on sand, it's a great step to then training on harder surfaces with cleats, because it's a softer surface, builds up some of those intrinsic foot muscles, makes you really work on your balance as well. Now, there's been some reports that he might be on the bench this weekend. I'm not sure about that, because the team has been very methodical and conservative with him, and they don't really have a need to rush him back, especially now if De Bruyne will be back with the team. In his case, it looked like he was finally moving pretty well on the pitch after a bit of an extended recovery. I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot or the ankle, pun intended, here with him trying to rush him back multiple times after he played far too quickly in the Euros, which tends to happen considering the gravity of those games. But it does look like he may be back. If you have more information, go ahead and chime in on that. And then one last thing to Lukaku, I think the fact that he's been managing that injury quite well, he said that is a good sign. But if there is a game where Tuchel might rest him, it might be this Aston Villa game where they are decimated and there is Champions League coming up.
Well, I think we've covered those subjects quite well then. And like Ben said, I'm going to echo it. Check out Raj's information on Free CB performance. But I think one of the things that has dominated the headlines recently is quarantine, Brazil, Argentina. I mean, we mentioned it at the beginning there, and I think it needs to be kind of discussed a little bit more. Ben, how realistic do you think it is that we're going to see this 5-day ban come into place? A lot of clubs seem to be very angry and not going to comply.
Watch this space. I mean, look, what would be it depends on the ramifications of clubs going against this FIFA 5-day ruling by involving ineligible players on, during this round of fixtures. Potentially, you'd have the Football Association on board, maybe the Premier League. Does that result in, if you have, is it a possible points deduction? Is it fine? Is it a lengthy ban? Is it something that's enforced by, I was going to say a higher power, but did FIFA come down harder and make that stipulation where they can't be involved? I mean, this 5-day rule isn't anything new. That's always been the case, and it's being implemented to protect those national teams and to ensure that. I mean, a lot of the time, a lot of the questions I get asked about international injuries, those players that mysteriously pick up an injury, a so-called injury, on the eve of joining up with their national team, and then they play in the subsequent game week. These rules are brought in to protect those teams, and even if a club, announces that a player is injured, then they still have to go to be independently assessed by their national team doctors. So it's not just a case of a Liverpool and Everton and Arsenal saying, player X is injured. They still have to travel. They still have to be assessed independently. For example, even Roberto Firmino is one of those players who's been flagged as part of this FIFA ruling. And we know that he picked up a hamstring injury against Chelsea in game week 3. And he was ruled out of that fixture anyway. But the fact that he didn't travel for that independent assessment means that the result of which that he will become under this ban along with the rest of those Brazilian players that did not travel.
So looking at this, Raj, this situation here, people have compared this to maybe the European Super League. The clubs were not punished. There was all this kind of bravado. But in that situation, it was UEFA. Do you think that clubs are just going to sit there and common sense not prevail? Because a lot of clubs were just protecting players for safety reasons, not putting them into a COVID red list country and then potentially losing them for a long while or to, prolonged period due to illness.
I mean, yeah, you'd hope so, but common sense often isn't that common. So, like I said, when it comes to these competing interests between FIFA, FA, and clubs, it's really hard to say. And I think it really comes down to the point that Ben made. Will FIFA have any teeth when it comes to their punishment? And if there's not, it doesn't really behoove any of the clubs to really listen to them, because in the end, they were looking out for their players' best interests, especially when it comes to some of these red-listed countries.
And this is a question maybe for both of you. In these situations like this, you've mentioned Firmino. Where does safety come in over the FIFA rules? Because it seems like that's being almost second at the moment. Like I said, common sense would prevail, and people would think, well, people don't want to risk potentially health, fitness, their lives, their careers going forward. I mean, Ben, this is an unprecedented situation, and I guess, will there be maybe possibly a situation where the clubs might make an appeal, and so the players could play this weekend, and then a future 5-day ban might come in after this appeal has been heard?
I really don't know. I think the issue has really arose because of in my understanding, and this is a minefield to me, I'm learning new things every day, but there was an elite sports person's exemption at one point, which would allow people or allow players within the Football Association to participate in organised competitive games and not therefore have to fulfill the normal quarantine requirements of your average person on the street. How that's been applied, if it's applied, it doesn't seem to, I just don't understand. There's too many grey areas with it now. If the government had just said, look, and I know what you're saying about players wanting to protect themselves. Ultimately, this is about the clubs wanting to protect themselves and have those players available for game week 4 and onwards and Champions League fixtures. Because if they had a went to red list, you've got that 10-day quarantine period. Elite level sports people, for the most part, if they abide by those, they're in these very secure what's the word I'm looking for? Biosecure bubbles, which they aren't imperishable, but they're fairly safe and secluded, and the risk to those players are minimal. I would say, are they any worse than being back here? Maybe not massively. So I think this is more about the clubs as opposed to maybe those players having concerns about their own safety and long-term health.
So going into this weekend, Ben, are you expecting that there could be a few shock players that might not be playing? Because you mentioned it a little bit earlier, they haven't had double jabs or other rules might come into place. That one is obviously guesswork. We have no clue with those situations there. But is that maybe a bit of advice that you might give to people this weekend to watch out for?
I mean, as always, it's a drum that I've been banging since pre-season when we've talked about strength and depth and on your bench. Because in this COVID world that we now live in, anything can literally happen. And you want to be starting the game with 11 players. I wouldn't suspect that a lot of managers will be disclosing information on squad availability. So I think it's just expect the unexpected, because there are going to be a few banana skins on an easy path to slip us up and trip us up along the way.
Let's move the discussions then on to hopefully a positive subject finally for Arsenal. Raj, I'm going to throw this one to you, but do you expect that Arsenal might be having close to their best 11 returning in game week 4?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like everyone's been trained except we know Jacques Razel. One with the red card, and he also got COVID, so he timed that pretty well. And so, but otherwise, it looks like everyone is back in training. And so I'd anticipate them to have near their full 11. I mean, their big injury doubt was Thomas Partey, but he's supposed to be back. He's been tracking the entire time, according to what the medical and training staff said. Ben White was back. Gabriel Magalhaes has been back. So, yeah, it looks like it. I think the question might be with their new acquisition with Tamayasu, considering he's been playing for Japan, that might be the question mark. But for the most part, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at this Arsenal starting 11. I mean, your thoughts on Emile Smith-Rowe was released from the England squad due to illness. And I was looking at that 11 and I was thinking, I was quite glad because it allowed me just to put Odegaard into that starting 11 because I couldn't quite fit everybody in with Aubameyang and maybe Lacazette. It is, if Smith-Rowe is fully fit, does he start in then? And how would you see that Arsenal front four? Because I'm a little bit lost. It's almost like that Manchester United front four. You've got about 7 players effectively who could, and there's not a great deal of difference between the quality of those. It's who Mikel Arteta goes for.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that a lot of people in the community of Arsenal fans have discussed is Arteta's selections aren't always the most logical. One would question why Sambi Lokonga was not starting and Xhaka was in that game. That there wasn't a reason, I don't think, unless you can correct me, Raj, that he was injured or anything like that. And so I think in terms of a favourite 11, I would love to see Ødegaard start because he played fantastically for Norway in terms of the international break. He didn't have any assists, but he was fantastic on the pitch, helping with, I think it was 12 key passes in that game. It was ridiculous kind of stats there. But whether Arteta will kind of reward people for playing well or stop people playing because they haven't played well, the likes of Chambers, I'm really not sure. I don't know if you can offer more of an insight, Raj, but I think it is difficult to predict an 11 for Arsenal, really.
Yeah, I think two things. One, to Lukonga, there's two reasons. One might have been fitness, right? He played multiple games in a row in a new league. Again, Premier League has a higher intensity, so it might have been that. But secondly, we saw versus Chelsea, his main weakness is shielding passing lanes defensively, and versus City, that's critical. So it might have been a tactical decision on that end as well to not have him in the match. But again, no reason given. That's just two things I thought of. I think, though, we saw second half of last year how Mikel really wants to play when he has ESR, when he has Saka, when he has Ødegaard, and he has Aubameyang available. Saka on the right, ESR on the left, Ødegaard centrally, although he tends to tilt a little bit to the right, and then Aubameyang playing up front. That's my guess, if he has everyone healthy, how he's going to play. But we've also never seen the full team play together. I don't know if ever. I mean, at this point, I don't know if he's ever had a starting 11 since Mikel came in healthy. So it's going to be interesting, with Ben White to see who he wants that link up play to be with, right? And so if I had to guess, it would be those four, just based off the results of the second half of the season. But then again, right now there's still some goals that we just don't know.
And I hope there's an improvement in performances as well, because even with those four there, I wouldn't say that we're fantastic, apart from maybe a few patches in those final few games of the season. The Chelsea result was pretty good in terms of that. But let's move it on to two clubs that are in a bit of a crisis, Aston Villa and Leicester. Ben, can you kind of give updates on the situation there with Aston Villa? Not only have they lost Martinez and Buendia, but there was some injury problems. And in Leicester, I mean, the backline woes just seem to continue.
Yeah, I mean, clubs hopefully coming in the right direction in terms of an emptying of their treatment room. We know that at Villa, Dean Smith has talked about the potential return of Leon Bailey, Bertrand Traore, even Morgan Sansom, who's been sidelined since I think it was last March or April due to a knee injury, which it was a lot more severe than initially thought. So those three players should be there or thereabouts. There's still concerns around Ezri Konsa, although that was played down initially post-match by Dean Smith. But, with the acquisition of Axel Tuanzebe, he could easily slot in alongside Tyrone Mings anyway. So, the importance of him, maybe that isn't essential. Jacob Ramsey, COVID, it should be fine. John McGinn, he returned for Scotland. He's fine. So really only long-term absentee in Trezeguet with his ACL. He's the major one, and Keenan Davis should be back on the training pitches maybe towards the end of this month. With regards to Leicester, again, we know that Brendan Rodgers has been suffering predominantly in that back line and trying to keep his defenders fit. Now it looks, and we're hoping that maybe Johnny Evans could be back in contention for this weekend. We know he's been managing an ongoing foot condition since the latter part of last season, and he was actually called up to the Northern Ireland squad, although realistically, based on the fact that he hasn't had any minutes at all, Brendan Rodgers said we'll keep him at Seagrove and we'll just get minutes on the training pitches there. So it could be that he's coming back into that. And we've also seen Ryan Bertrand return following his COVID. So he hasn't actually featured for Leicester since joining the club from Southampton. And also Yannick Vestergaard. Now, this one is a little bit of a question mark here with regards to that. He overstretched on the training pitches, ligaments in his left knee, but fortunately scan results came back and it wasn't too severe. It was minimal, if anything at all. So again, although we didn't have a definitive timeline, there was some suggestion given the break that he could be back maybe game week 4, game week 5. And we'll wait to see what's happening with Ricardo Pereira, who was forced off providing that assist at Carrow Road back in game week 3.
With that Pereira situation, Raj, does it surprise you at all because of his ACL injuries, or is this kind of maybe expected on his road to full recovery?
Yeah, I mean, once you're coming back from those major injuries, I always anticipate some hiccups or some roadblocks along the way, especially when you're ramping up and toward the start of the season. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest.
And with the Leicester team as well, Raj, do you think people need to be wary of bringing in any of their assets, looking at them as a team going forward, because the Europa League is now on the horizon?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a risk reward with them, especially along the back line, especially as you get more games with a depleted roster. So that's definitely a calculation that you have to make when it comes to looking at how many minutes are these players playing over congested time period, especially at the start of the season where you already know there's an increase in intensity, which can lead to some of these injuries, especially soft tissue injuries.
So the final thing that I want to raise awareness to, and we don't know too much about these injuries at the moment, kind of like what you said through the podcast, Ben, is we're kind of almost getting little tidbits, but I found it quite strange that both of Burnley's signings have joined the club and they're injured. I mean, how often does this happen, Ben? Is this a normal procedure? Is this risky?
I mean, it's not highly unusual. I think we're talking about Conor Roberts here and Nathan Collins. I don't know too much about the Nathan Collins. I suggest that it isn't too serious because he was called into that Republic of Ireland squad, I think, and then released. Conor Roberts picked up an injury during the Euros. He did have surgery on his groin. There was an estimated sort of return to play timeline of around about 12 weeks, and he's slightly ahead of schedule. But I mean, you only have to look across at maybe Crystal Palace with Michael Olise with his back problem, Nathan Ferguson with his knee injury. A lot of people seem to think that a player goes for a medical and almost a player passes or fails that medical. It isn't. What it is, it's an assessment, it's a judgment, and it just helps people make an informed decision on whether that player is able to cope or tolerate with the demands of the game, and if any sort of abnormalities or anomalies are flagged up during that process. Now, with these particular injuries, look, they've obviously been checked out, and the club, given the amounts of money that are involved and the stakeholders involved, Burnley are a club that's run on an extremely tight budget. They're not a type of club that will go out and spend millions on players and take risks. They'll be fairly confident in their medical team that these issues will be fixed in the short term, and they will have no long-lasting impact on that player's ability going forward. So, yeah, from the outside looking in, it may seem like a strange signing a player that maybe isn't ready to play immediately. But look, there are lots of things that come into play in and around, transfer windows and maybe other clubs coming in, maybe beating players with contracts running down. So sometimes, Raj always talks about this risk and reward, and it's that case. But ultimately, we're not talking about any club with a United with a huge budget who could maybe afford to write off X number of millions if a player doesn't quite fulfill his potential. We're talking about Burnley here. So I'm fairly confident and certain that these players will come in and they'll be absolutely fine going forward once they recover from these injuries.
I mean, Raj, I want to bring attention to it's quite a hard one for Arsenal fans. He knows what I'm going to talk about. Kim Kallstrom. I mean, what does it take for somebody to fail a medical and a club to kind of say, look, it's not worth that risk. There's not going to be much reward.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on the severity of the injury, like Ben talked about. What if there's potential abnormalities, during the medical that may lead to saying, hey, it's just not worth the risk, or hey, we want to renegotiate the deal. Like Nabil Fekir with Liverpool allegedly had excessive wear and tear in his knee following an ACL injury, and so they went back and said, there's been a debate whether they actually went back and said we want to redo the deal, or they just said no, we're not comfortable with it. But that's again to the point about where, based on what they're seeing, it gives them more information on the risk reward of that player. I think in Burnley's situation, sometimes when a player is injured, it might give the buying team more leverage to say, hey, we want to buy this player at even a reduced rate because we are taking on more risk, right? And so it might even behoove them a little bit to take on some of those players that they know will get better, but because the player is injured in the short term, it might allow them to get a better deal on them. So there can be some shrewd negotiations like that.
Well,
I mean, I would just like to chip in and say, we're looking at this as well from, with rose-tinted glasses, and we're thinking in the world of transfers and medicals that everything goes smoothly and everything's put into place prior to that deadline. I've spoke to members of medical teams who've had literally phone calls 2 hours before the deadline and say, right, we need to get this player through a medical. We need you to check him. No medical history. You're taking no medical notes. You're taking what the player says on face value. And, it is an absolute minefield, even in this day and age. So if stakeholders, chairmen, managers want to force through the deals, then ultimately you just have to maybe just do the bare minimum, to tick the few boxes to get them through, and hopefully, fingers crossed, hope that everything's going to be okay.
You know what? That sounds like a fascinating podcast for another day, but we have run out of time. I think we will open that out on another podcast another time, but we're going to have to end it up here. I just want to remind people, do subscribe to the channel. This is our weekly injuries podcast, but we've got so much other great content. But also make sure to check out Raj at FreeCB Performance. Check out his Twitter, his YouTube channel. There's just so much good content here. It's all absolutely free, and you can get involved with us. Send in questions. Send it to our Twitters. You can tweet us. You can comment below. But for now, I'm going to say thanks to both of you for being on. I mean, obviously I work with you, Ben, but a pleasure as always, Raj. And we'll see each other next week.